Recently, I received a request to talk about how to put an icon of sin into your Doom 2 map. The icon of sin is one of the generally accepted names for the gigantic face on the wall that appears at the end of Doom 2, others being the wall demon, the boss brain, or just the final boss. This makes for an interesting topic because this hideous edifice isn't a monster in the sense that the game usually thinks of them, and is made up of multiple objects that are completely unique in how they work. According to Sandy Peterson, who invented the concept, he came up with the idea under the pressure of needing a suitable climax for the game despite not having enough time in the development cycle for spriting and programming a real new boss monster. Faced with the constraints of not being able to have another cyber demon or spider mastermind, he chose to go even bigger, making a final challenge against a huge demon that only needed to be painted onto the wall as a static face. This giant goat skull continuously spits cubes from its exposed brain that become monsters when they land, and can only be defeated by riding the platform in the centre of its room upward, and with very precise timing firing rockets back into his head. The boss monster is made up of 5 different elements, none of which are actually monsters. They are a monster spawner, spawn cubes, spawn spots, John Romero's head, and sort of wall textures. I'll go through all of the workings of these individually at first, then show how to put them all together into a level. First of all, Romero's head is what you might call the heart of the boss, even though it doesn't do any of the thinking itself. This is the object that the player actually has to damage to defeat the boss and end the level. In Doom 2's last level, this object is never seen by the player, and its appearance was made up as an in-joke by the game artists, taking the picture of Romero from a magazine photo shoot. However, it can be seen by using cheats to walk through the wall to the back of the boss, and can also be placed in full view in a custom level just like any other object. Romero's starting health is nothing to speak of, having only 250 hit points, which is half of a Hell Knight and nowhere near the several thousand that are given to the Doom 1 boss monsters. The difficulty in this boss, as set up in Doom 2, comes from being in the right position to damage it. In the Icon of Sin level, the player has to fire a rocket through a very narrow gap, which will hit the wall above where Romero is hidden in a pit, dealing enough splash damage for its health to be depleted in 3 or 4 blasts. Once it reaches 0 health, the object will call the function Brain Scream. This function will spawn a collection of explosions 320 units south of the head at random X and Z coordinates. Interestingly, these objects are actually in-flight rockets, but they're spawned in a state where they've already partially exploded. Finally, the function plays the head's death scream sound effect. A couple of seconds later, the function Brain Die is called, which simply ends the level using the same function as if the player had walked over an exit line. The monster spawner is the boss's attack department and works in tandem with a number of spawn spots that are placed around the map. It's probably the thing that acts most like a normal Doom monster in the whole setup, and in the Doom 2 arrangement this object is placed in the forehead of the giant head on the wall. When the player first comes into its line of sight, it will call the function called Brain Awake, which plays the famous noise which, equally famously played backwards, is
"To win the game, you must kill me, John Romero."
Due to an oversight, the object is facing into the wall next to the brain tunnel directly east in map 30, but fortunately when the player enters the boss room they're teleported to a location where the spawner can only just see them regardless. As part of the same function, the object will cycle through all the thinkers in the level and add all the spawn spot actors, here referred to as MT Boss Target, to a list for referring to later. The monster spawner now lives up to its name and will attempt to spawn monsters. Every 150 ticks, or about 4 1/4 seconds, it will call the function Brain Spit. This will select the current target in the list prepared earlier, advance the counter so that it will point to the next item in the list next time round, then it creates a spawn cube object, or MT spawn shot, bound for the selected target's location. It also calculates the amount of time the cube will take to reach its destination, and stores this in the cube's reaction time variable. A spawn cube is the cube with a skull on it seen flying around during the boss level. They will fly directly at the spawn spot that they're bound for without any regard for obstacles, and will pass through any walls or items they might encounter on the way. As a spawn cube flies, it continuously calls the spawn fly function, which will decrement the reaction time variable until it reaches 0. The cube doesn't check for any collisions or proximity to the spawn spot and only relies on this reaction time counter. Therefore, the cube will detect its arrival at the target even if the spot it was aiming for has been moved or no longer exists. When the cube decides it's landed, it will spawn the same effect as the Archvile's fire attack and will then randomly create a monster from a hard-coded list of possibilities by picking a random number from 0 to 255. Imps have about a fifth of a chance of appearing, with the higher tier monsters receiving less likely values as they go up in power. The least likely choice is the Archvile, with a 2 out of 256 chance of appearing for unlucky players. Fortunately, the Cyber Demon and Spaster Midermind... the Spider Mastermind are excluded entirely. I'll leave that in. The creation of these monsters relies on yet another of Doom's hard-coded idiosyncrasies. Monsters usually can't be moved or created in a space already occupied by another object, so the rules are altered so that monsters are allowed to telefrag on map 30 only. Telefragging does 10,000 points of damage to whoever's on the other end, which overrides all protections, meaning that standing where a spawn cube is heading will kill the player even if they have an invulnerability power-up or even are using the God Mode cheat. There is a problem with cubes launched at a spot directly east or west of the spawner where they will never hit their destination and will just sail out of the level into the void. This is corrected in my usual port of choice GZ Doom, so I'm showing it in PR Boom here. This bug is the result of at least 3 interesting oddities that interact with each other. Firstly, the brain spit function only looks at how quickly the cube is going to travel along the y-axis to determine how much time it should fly. Here that y speed is called MOMY for momentum y. As secondary level physics taught you, the time for an object to get somewhere is equal to the distance travelled divided by the speed at which it's moving. If the target is directly east or west of the spawner, then the cube won't have to change its y position at all, so both the distance to travel and the speed of the object are 0. Normally, this would cause a divide by 0 error and a crash, however the day is saved by another inaccuracy in Doom's mathematics. For any projectile in the game, Doom has to take the angle the projectile wants to move at, the speed at which the projectile is moving, and work out how many x and y units the projectile should move as a result. Normally, you would do this using trigonometry. Taking the cosine and the sine of the angle the missile is facing and multiplying by its speed will break the speed down into x and y components. The spawn cube travels at 10 units per tick, so if it were travelling 30 degrees away from the x-axis, the game needs to know that on every tick it should move the cube 8.66 units on the x-axis and 5 units on the y-axis. Our potential crash occurs when the angle away from the x-axis is 0. Here the movement happens entirely along the x-axis, and the sine of 0 is also 0, leading to us getting nothing for our y-speed. However, because trigonometry is a pretty heavy thing to expect an early 90s computer to have to do all the time, the id Software team instead used a table of pre-calculated values instead of calculating sines and cosines every time. This table gives a value that's very slightly not 0 for the y component when an object is travelling directly west or east. Therefore, instead of dividing 0 by 0, we divide the distance 0 by a value that isn't quite 0, and so the answer to how much time the cube will take to reach its destination becomes simply 0. With all of that said, you would probably expect a west or east facing cube to launch and then immediately transform into a monster because its reaction time is already 0. But this isn't the case because of the order in which the spawnfly function does things. The reaction time counter is decremented immediately before it's checked for having reached 0 instead of afterwards. Therefore, the first time a cube with 0 reaction time is checked for arriving at its destination, the spawnfly function will decrement the reaction time counter to -1, check it against 0, decide it hasn't reached 0 yet, and then carry on subtracting from it, getting further away from 0 each time. Due to the way integers work, the cube's reaction time will eventually wrap around and reach 0, and you could see this if you were to keep the game running for approximately 11.5 years. For all these reasons, combined with the explosion effect triggered by Romero's head only creating explosions south of itself, the Icon of Sin works at its best when it's constructed to be on a south-facing wall and unlikely to need to fire cubes directly along the x-axis. There is yet another oddity with monster spawners, but it only shows itself if you have more than one of them in a level. Every 150 ticks, each monster spawner will call the brain spit function. The variable that points to the next target in the list is shared between all monster spawners, so with 2 of them present you would expect each of them to call the function, select the next target in the list and create a cube, therefore spitting 2 cubes at the same time towards the next 2 destinations. And that's exactly what happens, unless you're on the easy skill levels, in which case only one of the spawners will ever work. This behaviour is because of yet another special case in the code. Every time Brain Spit is called, before it gets to its main logic, it toggles a flag called Easy. The caret equals here makes it perform an exclusive OR on it, effectively setting it to 1 if it's 0 and 0 if it's 1. Then it will only perform the rest of the function if that flag is now on. The intended effect is for every second call to the function to just abort, therefore doubling the amount of time between cube launches on the Easy skill level. However, this flag is shared between spawners as well. So what happens with 2 spawners is that on each cycle, one of them will toggle the flag, see that it's set to 1 and go ahead with spawning its cube, then the other one will come in and toggle the flag back again, setting it to 0 and doing nothing. Therefore, with multiple spawners, only half of them will activate per cycle if the player is on easy mode. All these details aside, what I've been trying to say over the last 1000 words or so is, the monster spawner shoots spawn cubes at the spawn spots and they'll spawn monsters. Let's move on. To make up the appearance of the boss, there are 9 textures in Doom 2's WAD file that begin with ZZZ face, which are arranged somewhat clumsily in a 3x3 grid to form the full face as it's displayed in the level. Because you can't stack textures vertically, the boss is actually made up of a very steep staircase of walls, a detail that a player doesn't tend to notice because they're usually so far away from the assembled face. Something much more obvious is that the side of the face to the player's left is misaligned and his horn appears broken off by 16 units. At a glance, I had always assumed that his horn was just wedged behind a pipe at the top, but looking at the textures individually makes the mistake more obvious. In the middle of the forehead, a lava-like texture is placed in the hole in the skull's head. This is just a line def with a mid texture which allows the player's rockets to pass through and damage Romero's head on the other side. The textures used are completely unimportant to the operation of the Icon of Sin, and are just a facade to give the actual objects some context. I have demonstrated this by creating my own alternative to the demon head, featuring this hideous picture of the recently moved in Hell resident Rush Limbaugh, placing the objects in a slightly different arrangement to form a different final boss. This demented alternative version uses all the same objects as the more familiar original. Behind the face, in a cavern of putrid mouths, John Romero's head lies in wait to be damaged. In this edition, the entry point for rockets will be the mouth, normally covered by the lower half of a sector that's been placed in the way. To lower this sector temporarily, the player has to tumble to the bottom of the chamber to press the button on the computer that reveals the skull switch behind them, then fight their way up through the monsters and use the skull switch to temporarily open the gaping maw. They then have to shoot rockets with the right timing before it closes, then repeat the cycle again if they weren't able to do enough damage. Meanwhile, the invisible monster spawners are placed at the top of the radio towers. I've used 2 of them in this example. Every few seconds they'll shoot a cube each, aiming for the spawn spots that are along the player's route back to the top, as well as in the fiery chambers to the sides of the arena. This will make the player have to cope with projectile attacks from the sides, as well as the physical obstacles of the monsters getting in their way. As it is, this encounter is probably a shade too difficult. Putting 2 monster spawners in makes the onslaught very hard to deal with, especially as it doubles the chance of you getting a really problematic monster. If I were to put this in a real episode, I would probably also edit the relative chances of spawning different kinds of monsters, another property that GZ Doom exposes to the player on top of the vanilla options. Nevertheless, with some difficulty I was eventually able to get my own boss level's timing right and demonstrate on video that defeating it correctly advances the player to the next level. The Icon of Sin was a bit of a letdown in some ways, in being a bit of a workaround and not a large and impactful true monster like the Cyberdemon had been at the end of episode 2. He would eventually get his appearance as a full monster in Doom Eternal, when at the climax of the game he appears as a full-bodied gigantic mechanical goat in a battle where you have to strip him until he dies of embarrassment. But in 1994, under pressure of time, Sandy and company came up with a unique challenge unlike any other set piece in the Doom series, and gave map designers yet another set of possibilities to experiment with.